It was 2:13 a.m. when the pounding started on my door, sharp and desperate, the kind of knock that doesn't wait for sleep to finish. I jolted upright, my chest already heavy with dread before I even reached for the light. When I opened the door, my daughter stood there, my Amaya, 7 months pregnant, trembling with cuts along her cheek and bruises forming purple stains beneath her skin. Her hair was damp with sweat and tears, her clothes torn at the shoulder, and her voice came out in a cracked whisper that split my world in two. "Mom, please help. I'm dying." I didn't ask questions. I pulled her inside, and the smell of iron hit me, the metallic tang of blood on her clothes mixed with the faint sweetness of her perfume. Her knees buckled, and I caught her before she hit the floor, my hands pressing against the swell of her belly, as though I could protect both her and the life inside her at once. She shook like a leaf, her breathing shallow, her lips trembling against words she couldn't form. I dragged her to the couch, grabbed a towel, and pressed it against the cut on her forehead. Her eyes darted to the door as if expecting him to follow, as if the nightmare wasn't finished. I had seen my daughter cry before, but never like this. This was not the sob of heartbreak or the tears of disappointment. This was survival, raw, unfiltered, clinging to life by a thread. She tried to speak, but the words came out broken, drowned in sobs. He hit me. Mom, he hit me. She touched her stomach as though to reassure herself the baby was still there. I felt a fire rise in me, a rage I hadn't known lived in my bones. My Amaya, the child I raised through scraped knees, piano recitals, and nights of fevered prayers, was standing in front of me, battered by the man she had chosen to trust. I pressed her hand and told her she was safe now, but even as I said it, I knew safety was not a word that belonged in her marriage. She kept shaking her head, whispering his name like a curse, "Jason, Jason, Jason," as though repeating it made the wounds deeper. My mind raced through every warning I had given her, every instinct I had swallowed when she said she was in love, every uneasy silence I had forced on myself to keep the peace. I wanted to scream at the memory of it all, but now was not the time. Now, I had to hold her together, stitch her spirit back before it collapsed completely. She gripped my arm with a desperation that pierced through me. "Mom, he's going to ruin me. He's going to take everything." Her voice broke again, and she sobbed into her palms. I thought of the accounts she managed, the business she helped me run, the inheritance she would one day claim. All the pieces Jason must have had his eyes on while smiling at her across dinner tables. It wasn't just her body he wanted to break. It was her future, her very foundation. I lifted her chin so she would look at me. Her face was swollen, one eye darkening into a bruise that would tell its own story by morning. "You're not dying tonight," I told her. My voice was steady, but inside I was shaking with a fury that demanded blood. "Not while I breathe." She collapsed into my arms, the weight of her belly pressing against me as if two lives rested in my hands at once. I knew then that love for a child has no ceiling, no measure. It was primal. It was fire, and it demanded action. At that moment, I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I knew this. The man who laid his hands on my daughter had declared war, and I was going to answer it. The call I made before the sun rose would set fire to his carefully built world, and the ashes he choked on would be the price for every bruise he carved into her skin. Calvin Price had been gone for 15 years when he suddenly reappeared, as if time could be rewound with a single knock on the door. I still remember the morning Amaya told me. She walked into the kitchen, her voice carrying that mixture of excitement and disbelief, and said, "Mom, I saw Dad." My hand froze on the coffee mug. That name, Dad, was one she hadn't used since she was 10. In all the years I had raised her alone, I never denied his existence. I told her the truth. He was charming, ambitious, and weak. He wanted the image of family, but not the responsibility, and when the pressure of bills, commitments, and loyalty pressed in, he chose escape. I never stopped Amaya from remembering him, but I never painted him as a hero either. To me, Calvin was a man who cashed in love and left the receipt unpaid. When he returned, he didn't come with apologies. Not really. He came with stories, as if his absence had been a brief detour. He told Amaya he had been traveling, working, trying to build something worth sharing. He showed up in pressed shirts and a polished smile, playing the part of a father rediscovering his child. Amaya, 23, and still carrying the soft hope of a girl who wanted both parents, opened her heart faster than I wished. She clung to the idea that maybe his return meant completion, that maybe she could have the father-daughter bond she saw in movies and envied in friends. I wanted to be glad for her. Part of me, deep down, even hoped he might prove me wrong, that the years apart had matured him into the man she needed. But another part of me, the part that had stitched together rent payments with overtime shifts and raised her without a partner, knew better. I warned her the way a mother does, not with bans, but with boundaries. Amaya, you can see him if you choose, but be careful. People don't change just because you want them to. Watch what he does, not what he says. She nodded, but her eyes glowed with the kind of faith that can't be cautioned away. The first Sunday dinner was where everything shifted. Calvin invited her to meet an old friend of his, a man named Robert Miller, and Robert brought his son, Jason. The four of them sat across the table from me, laughing, reminiscing, while I watched with folded arms and the instinct of a hawk. Jason was smooth, too smooth. He listened intently, made jokes that landed too easily, and looked at Amaya in a way that wasn't casual. By dessert, I could see the spark in her eyes, the one she had never shown with anyone before. Calvin encouraged it, leaning back with a grin, as if matchmaking made him more of a father. I stayed silent, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. After that dinner, Amaya came home gushing about Jason. She told me he was kind, attentive, ambitious. She said he had dreams that aligned with hers, that he wanted a future where they built something together. I didn't want to crush her joy, but I knew what I had seen. I knew the patterns of men who wore charm like a second skin. I told her, carefully, don't rush. Get to know him. And remember, love is not blind. It just chooses not to look. She brushed off my words with the certainty of a young woman in love. To her, Jason was different. To me, he looked like a continuation of the same weakness I had fought against in her father. Still, I allowed it. I didn't forbid her. Forbidding only makes the heart rebel harder. I stood by and watched, hoping my warnings would echo in her mind when the time came. I didn't know then that Calvin's return wasn't a gift at all. It was an entry point, a bridge for Jason to cross into Amaya's life, and through him, into mine. I didn't know that behind Calvin's polished smile and Jason's eager eyes was a plan stitched together by greed, one that would one day bring my daughter to my door, at 2 a.m., bleeding and begging for life. The night Calvin returned, a door reopened. But it wasn't a door to reconciliation. It was a door to betrayal. And we had just stepped through it. From the moment Jason began circling Amaya with his easy charm, I felt it. Not in the way people speak of gut feelings as superstition, but in the sharp calculation behind his smiles. He laughed at the right moments, complimented me as though rehearsed, and spoke of building a future with the kind of broad strokes men use when they have no intention of filling in the details. I watched him study Amaya in a way that wasn't devotion, but possession, the way someone appraises something they intend to own. I couldn't let it pass without a word. One evening, Amaya came home flushed with excitement, her phone buzzing constantly with his messages. She sat across from me, her eyes glowing, and told me how Jason had taken her out, how he spoke about dreams of business, travel, and a home filled with children. She smiled as though every word from his lips was gold. I sat quietly until she finished, then asked her the one question no young woman in love ever wants to hear. Do you really know him, Amaya? She frowned, defensive in an instant. Mom, I know enough. He's not like other men. He listens. He understands me. I leaned forward, lowering my voice, because I wanted her to hear the weight in it. Sweetheart, listening and understanding are cheap performances when a man has an agenda. Watch his actions. Watch how he handles money, how he treats people who can't give him anything back. That's where the truth lives. She rolled her eyes, the way only a daughter can when she thinks her mother is standing in the way of her happiness. Mom, you're judging him because of Dad. Jason isn't Dad. He's better. He's everything I've prayed for. The words cut because they revealed the quiet ache she still carried from Calvin's abandonment. She wanted Jason to be proof that her father's absence hadn't cursed her. I wanted to tell her that love built on desperation is the most dangerous kind, but I knew if I pushed too hard, she would cling to him tighter just to prove me wrong. Over the following weeks, Jason began showing up more often. He carried himself into our lives with practiced ease, bringing flowers for Amaya and polite nods for me. He asked questions about the boutique, about the business Amaya helped me manage, sliding them into conversation like casual curiosity. But I noticed the way his eyes sharpened whenever money was mentioned, the way he leaned closer when figures slipped into our talks. He wasn't studying Amaya's dreams. He was studying her assets. I voiced my concerns again, softer this time, hoping to plant seeds instead of ignite rebellion. Amaya, love is not a race. Take your time. If Jason is the man you think he is, he'll still be here a year from now, unchanged. But if he's not, time will show you before it's too late. She sighed, exasperated, as though I was pulling her back from a life she was determined to leap into. Mom, you don't get it. He's already talking about marriage. He's serious about me. And I love him. Isn't that what you always wanted for me? To find someone who cares. I wanted to tell her that care is proven when storms come, not when skies are clear. But I knew my words were falling on the ears of a woman who had already chosen her path. She was blinded not by foolishness, but by hope, and hope is the strongest blindfold of all. When Jason proposed months later, Amaya said yes with tears streaming down her cheeks. She ran to me, ring glittering on her hand, expecting celebration. I hugged her, because what else could I do? But inside, a weight settled in my chest. I knew this was not the beginning of a fairy tale. It was the start of a fight I wasn't sure I could win. The wedding was set, the plans rushed, and my warnings folded into silence. A mother's words had been spoken, but a daughter's heart had already decided. The wedding came and went in a blur of satin, vows, and promises spoken under lights that made everything look softer than it really was. Amaya glowed that day, radiant with belief that she had found the man who would rewrite the story her father left unfinished. I stood beside her, smiling for the cameras, praying in silence that maybe, just maybe, my doubts were wrong. But weddings are performances. Marriages reveal the script, and it didn't take long for Jason's lines to change. At first, it was subtle, small questions dressed as casual interest. How much does the boutique bring in each month? What kind of savings account do you keep? Do you and your mom still share those investments? He asked with the charm of a husband eager to plan a future, but his eyes gave him away. They didn't shine with curiosity. They narrowed with calculation. When Amaya hesitated, he guilted her into sharing. We're family now, he'd say. There should be no secrets between us. Soon, his voice grew sharper. He criticized the way she managed her money, telling her she was careless, too trusting, too much like her mother. He positioned himself as the responsible one, the man who could protect her from her own supposed naivety. And Amaya, still wrapped in the glow of new love, bent beneath his words. She second-guessed herself, asked me less for advice, and instead echoed his criticisms as though they were truths she had discovered on her own. The control crept into her routines. 2. He didn't like the hours she spent at the boutique, so he began dropping by unannounced, insisting she come home early. He questioned the friends she kept, the phone calls she took, the time she spent with me. When she resisted, he shifted tactics. He'd sulk, reminding her of sacrifices he had supposedly made for her, recounting imaginary slights, painting himself as the wounded husband who gave everything and got nothing in return. Guilt became his leash, and slowly he pulled her closer. The worst part was watching the isolation work. Amaya began canceling plans, avoiding her best friend, and answering my calls with a hurried tone that said someone was listening in the background. She stopped confiding in me altogether, hiding behind assurances that Jason just wants the best for us. I recognized the pattern too well. Control never bursts in with fists at the start. It seeps in through questions, grows through accusations, and cements itself with silence. I confronted her one afternoon when she visited me alone, her smile thinner than I'd ever seen it. Amaya, you're shrinking yourself for him. I told her. That's not love, it's ownership. She flinched, her eyes darting away. Mom, please, she whispered, don't start. You don't understand him. He's under a lot of pressure with his business. He just needs support. She said it like she was convincing herself as much as me. Jason's business was already faltering, though he never admitted it outright. I heard whispers, saw the late notices that slipped through their mailbox. Instead of facing his failures, he siphoned from their joint account, treating Amaya's savings as his lifeline. Every time she questioned a missing amount, he raised his voice, turned the spotlight back on her, accusing her of not trusting him, of undermining him as a husband. And when her tears fell, he wrapped his arms around her like a comforter, as though the pain he caused gave him the right to console her. From the outside, they still looked perfect, two young newlyweds building a life together. But I saw the cracks forming. Each time Amaya walked through my door, I noticed how her laughter dimmed, how her shoulders hunched as though she carried an invisible weight. She tried to assure me everything was fine, but fine does not leave bruises on the heart. Fine does not silence a daughter. who once told me everything. Jason's mask had slipped, and what lay beneath wasn't a partner, it was a predator dressed in promises. And I knew, with every instinct a mother possesses, that this was only the beginning of his unraveling. It started with little things Amaya brushed off, Jason being too quick to compliment her best friend, lingering too long in conversation, his eyes following when he thought no one noticed. At first, she ignored it, chalking it up to his natural charm, the same charm that had swept her off her feet. But charm has boundaries, and Jason was crossing them with intention. He began texting late at night, messages that carried just enough familiarity to blur the line between friendship and something more. He called her beautiful, asked about her day with an intimacy that had nothing to do with being his wife's friend. Her best friend, loyal to a fault, tried to avoid him, but silence doesn't stop a man like Jason. He pushed harder, showing up at her job, waiting in parking lots, pressing her to go out for just one drink. When she refused, he twisted it, accusing her of misinterpreting him, then doubling back with even bolder advances. It wore her down until she couldn't keep it to herself anymore. One evening, she came to Amaya in tears, her voice shaking as she admitted, "Jason's been trying to get with me. I didn't want to tell you, but I can't keep pretending." The words ripped through Amaya like glass. She sat frozen, the truth slicing through every defense she had built for her husband. Rage came first, then disbelief. She confronted Jason that night, her voice trembling, demanding answers. And Jason, master manipulator that he was, didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He twisted the knife deeper. "If you were giving me what I needed," he snapped, "I wouldn't have looked elsewhere." The audacity stunned her, turning his betrayal into her fault, shifting blame onto the woman carrying his child. Amaya's anger crumbled into despair. He told her she was too distracted with the pregnancy, too focused on her mother's business, too cold, too distant. He painted himself as the neglected husband, forced into temptation by her supposed failures. And then, when her tears fell, he softened his tone, wrapping his lies in false tenderness. "I love you, Amaya. You're overreacting. Don't ruin what we have over some silly misunderstanding." But misunderstandings don't leave text trails. They don't show up in the tearful confession of a best friend who had everything to lose by speaking the truth. Amaya knew it, but the weight of her reality pressed down on her, 7 months pregnant, tied to a man who already had his hands on her finances, isolated from her friends, and cut off from the mother she once ran to for everything. She felt trapped, and Jason knew it. That was his leverage. He leaned into her vulnerability, convincing her that exposing him would only embarrass her, humiliate her, prove her mother right. And Amaya, desperate to hold on to the dream she had built in her mind, stayed silent. When she told me pieces of it later, she tried to downplay the severity as though minimizing it might make it hurt less. But I saw the shift in her. I saw how her trust had fractured, how her glow had dimmed further, how the laughter she once shared with her best friend turned into strained smiles and awkward silences. Betrayal had moved into her home, and Jason acted as if he had a right to it. What Amaya didn't yet realize was that this was only the start of his unraveling. Betrayal is never a single act. It's a pattern. And Jason was just beginning to show how far he was willing to go to take everything from her, piece by piece. The first time Amaya noticed the balance was off, she thought it was a mistake. A simple banking error, maybe a payment that hadn't cleared. But When she opened their joint account again, a few days later, another chunk of money was gone. At first, Jason was quick with explanations. Business investments, he said, tapping the screen of his phone like he had numbers and contracts to prove it. He spoke with conviction, the kind of confidence that could convince a stranger in a room. But Amaya wasn't a stranger. She knew what they had saved, every deposit they'd made, the future they'd planned. The money wasn't moving toward growth. It was vanishing. Jason had always spoken big about his landscaping business, painting it as a venture on the edge of breaking through. But the truth was, it was crumbling under poor decisions and mounting debt. Equipment sat unpaid for, clients stopped calling, and the men who once worked under him had scattered. He was desperate, and desperation doesn't admit weakness. Instead, he turned to the money Amaya had worked for, the savings she built from long days at the boutique, from years of careful planning with me. He siphoned it bit by bit, covering losses, paying off creditors, living above his means, all while assuring her that he was investing in their future. At first, Amaya wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe the man she married was building something, not tearing everything down. But when she pressed for details, what company, what deal, where the returns would come from, his answers grew sharper. "Don't you trust me?" he would snap. "Why do you always assume the worst?" And when she pushed further, he turned it into a guilt trip. "I'm trying to take care of us. I'm carrying this family. The least you could do is support me." Every conversation became a trap. If she questioned him, she was ungrateful. If she stayed silent, the account continued to bleed. It was a slow suffocation, watching her hard-earned security dissolve while being told she was the problem for noticing. Jason never cut back on himself. New shoes, expensive dinners, nights out under the guise of networking. He lived as though the money was endless, as though consequences didn't exist. And when the bills piled up, he pointed to the same empty promises. One big deal, Amaya. Just one, and everything will change. But deals never came. What did come were more withdrawals, more receipts that didn't add up, more overdraft notices slipping quietly into their mailbox. Amaya started to keep her own hidden ledger, scribbling balances in a notebook, circling missing amounts, watching helplessly as their safety net unraveled. She tried to reason with him, begging him to stop draining the account, reminding him of the baby they had coming, the future they needed to secure. Jason didn't hear her. Or maybe he did, but chose not to care. The worst part wasn't just the theft. It was the erosion of trust. He took not only her money but her confidence, convincing her that speaking up was disloyal, that her instincts were flawed, that she was the one destabilizing the marriage. That's what abusers do. They strip you twice, once of your resources and once of your belief that you have the right to fight back. By the time she confided in me about the missing money, she was already broken down, her voice heavy with shame. "Mom, I think he's using me," she whispered, as if admitting it aloud made it too real. I wanted to scream, to storm into their home and pull her out, but I bit my tongue. If I moved too fast, she would cling to him harder. Jason had already planted the idea that I was against him, against their marriage. I couldn't let him win that battle by proving him right. The account continued to shrink, and with it, Amaya's hope. Jason wasn't just draining money, he was draining her spirit. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only a rehearsal for the betrayal still to come. When the weight grew too heavy for her to carry alone, Amaya turned not to me, but to Calvin. It was the choice of a daughter still craving what she had always missed, the counsel of her father. One evening, after another argument with Jason over the vanished money, she drove across town to meet Calvin at a diner. Her belly was round, her face pale, her hands trembling against the coffee cup she clutched like a lifeline. She told him everything: the drained account, the guilt trips, the constant tension in the house. She expected outrage, maybe even protection. What she got instead was a history lesson disguised as advice. Calvin listened with that polished calm he always carried, nodding like a man rehearsing empathy. When she finished, waiting for his response, he leaned back, sighing as though the answer was obvious. "Marriage is hard, Amaya," he said. "Your mother never understood that. She left when it got tough. That's why things fell apart. But you have to endure. That's what family does. You stay and work it out." The words landed like stones in her chest. Endure. As if bruises and betrayal were hurdles to step over instead of wounds to be treated. Endure. As if the erosion of her finances and dignity were minor inconveniences in the noble suffering of marriage. He framed it as strength, as legacy, but beneath it was the echo of his own failure. He had abandoned a family once, and instead of owning that truth, he recast endurance as the virtue that excused his absence. Amaya left the diner more broken than when she arrived. She realized her father wasn't going to save her. He wasn't going to challenge Jason, wasn't going to stand in the gap the way a father should. Instead, he placed the burden back on her shoulders, telling her to stay silent, to swallow her pain, to prove herself stronger by surviving it. It was betrayal disguised as guidance. When she came to me later, she didn't tell me the full details of their conversation. She only said, "Dad thinks I should just try harder," her voice flat, eyes empty. I felt my insides twist because I knew that line too well. Years ago, Calvin had told me the same thing. Endure. I had endured until my spirit cracked, until I realized endurance in a broken marriage isn't love, it's slow death. That's why I walked away. And now, here he was feeding our daughter the same poison he once tried to feed me. Silence became Amaya's shield after that night. She stopped reaching out, stopped voicing her pain. When Jason's temper flared, she endured. When money disappeared, she endured. When isolation grew heavier, she endured. She wore endurance like armor, not realizing it was corroding her from the inside. Jason, of course, thrived in the silence. It gave him more space, more power, more unchecked control. Every unspoken protest became permission in his eyes. I watched her slipping further away from me, the distance widening each time I tried to break through. She insisted everything was fine, parroted Jason's words about building a future, about standing by her man. But her eyes betrayed her. They carried the dull glaze of someone taught that suffering was noble, that silence was survival. It was Calvin's legacy playing out in the worst way possible, an inheritance of silence. And for Jason, it was a gift, because a woman taught to endure is a woman who can be controlled, and he knew it. Amaya thought she was protecting her marriage. In truth, she was being erased inside it. Patricia Miller arrived like an uninvited storm. She came with the language of a helping hand, telling Amaya she wanted to be close during the last months of the pregnancy, to cook meals, to keep the house in order, to offer the kind of maternal guidance she insisted only she could provide. But beneath the practiced warmth, I recognized the same thread that ran through Jason, entitlement dressed as generosity. Patricia carried herself as though the home belonged to her, moving into the guest room without asking, rearranging cabinets, inserting herself into conversations with the authority of someone who hadn't earned it. Amaya, worn thin from months of emotional strain, accepted her presence with polite hesitation. Jason, however, welcomed it with open arms, as though her arrival meant reinforcement. It didn't take long for Patricia's real agenda to surface. Within a week, she began reminiscing about her so-called retirement years. She spoke at length about sacrifices she had made, the life she had given to raise her children, and how she deserved a grand celebration. At first, it sounded like idle talk, the kind of wistful, dreaming people indulge in when imagining their twilight years. But then she started attaching numbers to her words. Plates and flowers, venues and entertainment, all amounting to a staggering $50,000. She said it casually, like she was asking for groceries, but the weight of it hung in the air. Jason didn't push back. In fact, he nodded along, already calculating how to make it happen. Amaya stared at her in disbelief. $50,000? For a party? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Patricia's expression hardened. It's not just a party, dear. It's a tribute. A woman like me deserves to be honored. My friends will expect it. Jason tried to soften the tension, chuckling, Mom just wants something nice. We'll figure it out. But the look in his eyes wasn't lighthearted. It was determined. Amaya confided to me later that the conversations became relentless. Patricia pressed daily, framing the demand as a matter of respect. If you really cared for family, you'd find a way, she said. Jason echoed her sentiments, pressuring Amaya to dip further into what was left of their savings. Amaya refused. She had watched too much vanish already, felt too much ground pulled from under her. We can't do this, she told them one evening. We have a baby coming. Our future matters more than a party. That refusal ignited the night everything broke. Dinner began quietly enough, roast chicken, potatoes, Patricia's commentary filling the room with critiques about seasoning and presentation. Then she brought it up again, about the retirement party. She said, setting down her fork with a deliberate clink, Jason, we should start making payments soon. $50,000 doesn't just appear overnight. Jason turned to Amaya, expectant, as though this time she would bend. But she didn't. No, she said firmly, we're not doing this. It's irresponsible. The room froze. Jason's jaw tightened. Patricia's eyes narrowed. And then the shouting began. Jason accused her of being selfish, of disrespecting his mother, of undermining him as a husband. Amaya, exhausted but unyielding, stood her ground. I will not throw away our future for a party, she said, her voice trembling but steady. That's when it happened. Jason snapped. He shoved his chair back, so hard it scraped against the floor, and before she could even brace herself, his hand came down across her face. The sound cracked through the room, like a gunshot. Amaya staggered, clutching her swollen belly, her chair tipping backward. Patricia didn't scream, didn't intervene. She just sat there, lips pursed, watching as though violence were a justified response to defiance. Jason hit her again, this time with the full weight of his anger, sending her sprawling against the table. A plate shattered on the floor, shards scattering around her feet. Blood bloomed where her skin split, and her cries echoed off the walls. 7 months pregnant, bruised and bleeding, Amaya struggled to her feet, her breaths coming ragged. She looked at Jason, at Patricia, at the family she thought she had joined, and saw only betrayal. With trembling hands, she grabbed her keys from the counter. Jason shouted after her, his voice dripping with fury, but she didn't stop. She staggered out the door, into the night, and into her car. When she finally reached my doorstep, pounding with the last of her strength, she carried more than bruises. She carried the weight of betrayal from both husband and mother-in-law, the crushing truth that the home she thought would protect her had turned into a battlefield. And in that moment, as I pulled her into my arms, I knew silence was over. This war was no longer just hers. It was mine too. The moment I saw my daughter's body collapse against my couch, her face swollen, her skin streaked with blood and tears, I knew this was no longer a matter of family disputes or whispered warnings. This was war. Jason had declared it when he raised his hand against her, and Patricia had sealed her role by sitting silent while it happened. The bruises on Amaya's face were fresh, but the wounds that ran deeper, the drained accounts, the isolation, the endless guilt had been festering for months. And now, with my daughter 7 months pregnant, trembling under my roof at 2 a.m, I could no longer sit back and pray for her strength. Strength was not enough. She needed action. She needed a weapon. She needed me. I picked up my phone, and I didn't call an ambulance or a family member or a lawyer. I called Marcus Blake. To some, he was just a man in uniform, a police officer with a reputation for being relentless and thorough. But to me, and to Amaya, Marcus was something else. A past love, a man who once held her heart with gentleness, and who had never stopped carrying a quiet loyalty for her long after she walked away. He had been the one she left behind in college, when Jason's charm swept her into a different life. And though Marcus never married, never fully moved on, he never poisoned her name with bitterness. Instead, he stayed in contact with me, checking in now and then, always respectful, always steady. When I dialed his number that night, I knew he would answer. Regina, his voice was groggy but firm. What's wrong? I didn't waste time. It's Amaya, I said. He nearly killed her tonight. She's here. She's bleeding. And she's pregnant. Marcus, I need you. There was no hesitation on his end. Text me your address. I'll be there in minutes. When he arrived, the blue and red flash of his unmarked cruiser cast harsh light across my driveway. He walked in with the authority of a man trained to handle chaos, but when his eyes landed on Amaya curled under a blanket, bruised and shaking, something inside him cracked. He knelt beside her, his hands gentle but steady, his voice low and soothing. You're safe now, he told her. She looked at him through swollen eyes, recognition flickering faintly. Marcus didn't waste time with small talk or sympathy. He began documenting everything, the cuts, the bruises, her statement of what happened at the dinner table, every detail she could whisper through trembling lips. He photographed her injuries, noted the time, and promised that a medical exam would follow to strengthen the case. But what struck me most was the fire in his eyes, not just as an officer, but as a man who had once promised to protect her and still meant it. As the hours stretched toward dawn, Marcus started connecting threads Amaya hadn't fully seen herself. He asked questions Jason had never expected anyone would ask, about missing funds, about new credit lines opened under their names, about business investments that didn't exist on paper. Amaya hesitated at first, Unsure if she was ready to expose everything, but under his calm persistence, she confessed the truth: how Jason drained their joint savings, how Patricia pressed for the $50,000 retirement party, how her father, Calvin, had advised her to endure instead of fight back. Marcus wrote it all down. "This isn't just abuse," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is a pattern. Financial manipulation, fraud, conspiracy. He's building something rotten, and I'm going to pull it apart piece by piece." That night, as I stood in the corner of my own living room, watching Marcus carefully protect my daughter, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. Not because the war was over, but because we finally had someone on our side who could fight back with more than warnings. Someone who could drag Jason out into the open, expose every scheme, and strip him of the control he thought was unshakable. The call I made to Marcus wasn't just a plea for help. It was the first strike in Jason's downfall. By the time the sun rose, the investigation had already begun, and Jason's carefully crafted mask was starting to crack. Marcus worked fast. Within days of documenting Amaya's bruises, he shifted his attention to the money trail Jason and Patricia had tried to bury. He combed through bank statements, tracing every transfer and withdrawal. What looked like small, harmless transactions at first began forming a pattern: consistent amounts funneled into an account Patricia controlled. The deposits didn't stop there. They were routed again, this time into a joint account with a name Marcus recognized immediately: Calvin Price, my ex, Amaya's father. The revelation hit like a blow. For months, Patricia had dressed her demand in the language of vanity: a retirement party, $50,000 for plates and flowers, and guests who supposedly expected luxury. But Marcus's evidence showed something else entirely. The party was a cover. The money was never meant for celebrations. It was part of a quiet scheme between Patricia and Calvin, a partnership built not on love but on greed. They had been siphoning funds under Jason's nose, using his failing business and Amaya's savings as their personal reservoir. Marcus shared the findings with me in my kitchen, spreading out the paperwork like puzzle pieces. "Look here," he said, pointing to the transactions. Every time Jason drained their account, a portion ended up funneled into this one. And that second name, you see it, don't you? My throat tightened when I read it. Calvin Price. The same man who had told our daughter to endure. The same man who once abandoned us, and now returned only to stand with the woman who enabled Jason's violence. It all snapped into focus. Calvin hadn't just come back into Amaya's life to play father. He came back to position her, to tie her to Jason, to create a bridge between two families that could be exploited. Patricia's demand for $50,000 wasn't a whim. It was a calculated move, the next phase of a long game. And Jason, blinded by arrogance and desperate to prove himself, played his role perfectly. He thought he was in control, but he was nothing more than a pawn in a larger scheme his mother and Calvin had been feeding for months. Marcus dug deeper, pulling property records and loan applications. He found Jason's signature on documents that attempted to leverage Amaya's assets, deeds and business filings that were never discussed with her. And each time Patricia's name surfaced alongside Calvin's, the picture sharpened. They were preparing to strip Amaya of everything she had built, launder it through Jason's failing business, and split the proceeds between themselves. When Amaya saw the evidence, her face crumbled. She had endured Jason's betrayal, Patricia's coldness, and her father's silence, but seeing them all tied together in black and white numbers was unbearable. So they were in on it together. She whispered, her voice hollow. My father, his mother, all of them. Her hands went instinctively to her stomach, cradling the child inside her, as if shielding the baby from the truth. I sat beside her, rage boiling in my chest. Betrayal has layers, but this was the deepest cut of all. Calvin hadn't just abandoned me years ago. He had returned to exploit our daughter, aligning himself with the very woman who enabled her abuse. Patricia wasn't simply a meddling mother-in-law. She was a conspirator, leveraging her son's collapse to enrich herself. And Jason, foolish and cruel, was the perfect puppet, too arrogant to see he was being used by his own mother. Marcus placed a hand on Amaya's shoulder, steady and reassuring. This is bigger than you, Amaya. Bigger than Jason. They're running a scheme that touches fraud, theft, maybe even conspiracy. I'm going to take this higher. They won't get away with it. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of hope in my daughter's eyes. Not because the pain was gone. It never truly leaves, but because now, finally, the truth had been dragged into the light. Patricia and Calvin thought they were playing with pawns. They hadn't accounted for the call I made that night, or for Marcus's relentless pursuit of justice. What began as bruises on Amaya's body had unraveled into something far greater, a network of lies, greed, and betrayal that stretched across two families. And Marcus had only just begun to dismantle it. The morning Jason was taken away in handcuffs, the neighborhood stood still. Patrol cars lined the street, lights flashing against the quiet houses that had once seen him as a charming young husband with a promising future. He tried to talk his way out of it, shouting about misunderstandings, insisting it was a family dispute blown out of proportion. But the officers didn't hesitate. The photographs Marcus had taken of Amaya's bruises, the medical reports, and the financial records told a story Jason couldn't spin away. His arrogance drained from his face when they read the charges: assault, fraud, attempted theft, and conspiracy. The mask was gone. For Patricia, the downfall was slower, but no less brutal. When investigators traced the $50,000 scheme and uncovered the account she shared with Calvin, her carefully curated image collapsed. Friends who once admired her sophistication now whispered about fraud and greed. The so-called retirement party was revealed for what it was: a cover for laundering money through Jason's failing business. Patricia tried to feign ignorance, claiming she had no idea where the money came from, but the paper trail was undeniable. When bank officers testified, when Marcus laid out the evidence, her lies unraveled. She went from respected matriarch to conspirator in a courtroom stripped of dignity she had spent decades cultivating. And then there was Calvin. Watching him exposed was both satisfying and devastating. This was the man who had abandoned his family years ago, who returned only to betray his daughter for profit. When investigators revealed his partnership with Patricia, even Jason looked stunned. Calvin had stood in his corner, urging Amaya to endure, all while plotting with Jason's mother to bleed her dry. His reputation, already fragile, disintegrated overnight. Business associates pulled away, his accounts were frozen, and the people he had hoped to impress with his grand return wanted nothing to do with him. In court, he was painted as a man who used his daughter as a pawn in his own schemes. Whatever excuse he offered fell flat. The truth was too heavy. For Amaya, watching all of this unfold was like peeling away layers of a nightmare she hadn't asked for. Jason, once her husband, now sat behind bars awaiting sentencing. Patricia, once the woman who lectured her about family duty, was disgraced and facing fraud charges. And Calvin, the father she had prayed for, was revealed as nothing more than a selfish man who chose greed over blood. Each of them destroyed themselves, not because they were caught off guard, but because they believed they were untouchable. The punishments came swiftly. Jason's plea bargain couldn't save him from years in prison. The violence he inflicted on Amaya sealed his fate. Patricia lost everything: her savings, her social standing, her freedom. Calvin's downfall was poetic justice. He had spent years chasing wealth and connections, only to end in financial ruin, forced to face the daughter he betrayed with nothing left to show but disgrace. Through it all, Marcus stood steady. He made sure Amaya's voice was heard in every hearing, every testimony. He wasn't just an officer. He was a protector, a reminder that not all men around her were built on lies. And for me, standing at the back of those courtrooms, watching the three of them stripped of the power they once held, I felt a grim kind of peace. This was justice, not perfect, not erasing the pain, but balancing the scales in a way we could finally live with. They had wanted to take everything from my daughter, her money, her dignity, her future. Instead, they lost their freedom, their names, and the illusion of control they had clung to. And in that wreckage, Amaya finally began to rebuild, free from the chains they tried to lock her in. The months after the trial were quiet in a way we hadn't known for years. No more slammed doors, no more drained accounts, no more walking on glass around Jason's temper. Instead, the air in my home carried the soft rhythms of healing, doctor's visits, whispered reassurances, and the sound of my daughter slowly learning how to breathe again. Amaya gave birth in the spring, the baby arriving strong and healthy, untouched by the violence that nearly stole both their lives. I stood by her side, holding her hand as she cried through the pain, and when she finally laid eyes on her child, I saw something return to her face. Hope. The kind of hope that had been stolen, then buried, but not destroyed. Jason sat in prison by then, his sentence handed down without sympathy. Patricia was stripped of her pretenses, her fraud laid bare, for everyone to see. And Calvin, my daughter's father, the man who chose betrayal over love, was left in ruins, a hollow man with no one left to manipulate. Their downfalls didn't erase the scars, but they made space for Amaya to rebuild on her own terms. Marcus became part of that rebuilding, quietly at first, never pushing, never asking for more than Amaya was ready to give. He checked in, helped with the baby, handled legal paperwork with the same steady hands that once carried her through college years. Slowly, the distance between them shrank. One afternoon, I saw him holding the baby, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen, and Amaya watching him with something she hadn't allowed herself in years, trust. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't a rebound. It was the return of a love that had been patient enough to wait, strong enough to survive the wreckage. For me, the reflection came late at night, when the house was quiet and the baby finally asleep. I would sit at the kitchen table, the same place I had made that call to Marcus, and replay the moment in my mind. My daughter standing at my door at 2 a.m, broken and begging for help. My decision to pick up the phone. That call was the line between life and death, between silence and justice. It was the strike that broke Jason's hold, Patricia's schemes, and Calvin's deception. It was the moment I chose revenge, not the loud, fiery kind, but the steady, precise kind that dismantles enemies piece by piece until there is nothing left of their illusions. Amaya survived. She became a mother under circumstances that would have crushed most, yet she rose. She rebuilt not just for herself, but for her child, learning that strength isn't in endurance alone, but in knowing when to fight back. Marcus found his way back into her life, not as a savior, but as a partner, someone who had waited on the sidelines until she was ready to trust him again. And me, I carry no regrets. I spoke my warnings, I endured the silence, and when the time came, I acted. Betrayal taught us pain. Justice taught us patience. But that call, that single call I made in the darkest hour, taught me that revenge doesn't always come with fire. Sometimes it comes with truth, with exposure, with the steady unraveling of those who thought they could take everything and get away with it. My daughter is alive. My grandchild breathes free. And the ones who tried to break her now sit with nothing but the weight of their own disgrace. That is my victory. That is her new beginning.